Hi everyone, because I know a number of you really struggle with the way to put this together. I had them in separate videos, and I know that the way they do it on lynda.com can be completely differently than I do it. So if you didn't end up looking at my videos, then you may have struggled a little bit with this. So I'm just going to run through one video that I would take for each step as we go through this. Now, a lot of the techniques that we're using here are actually really simple techniques. People think that you need to know really elaborate techniques, and I'm trying to remember whether I put the the split frequency retouching onto the core supplements. But you can do this one without doing anything like that. It's really very easy to do. So some of the tools that you'll use for this, there's obviously the healing tool. Now, when I go into my healing brush tool, this is where it is. It's the second one down. But I'm going to do this with the spot healing brush tool. The reason that I use the healing brush tool is when I want to remove lines, so I can kind of paint them in as lines. But for spots, the spot healing brush tool usually works pretty well. So we'll use that for the moment. Now, I'm trying to work out whether or not I can do this with the screen at this size. I have to work with a really small screen because of the video capture, so it's not quite as easy as if I was just doing this as a normal retouch. So first thing I want to do is I don't want to retouch to the background. If I make a mistake, I can't erase it. A lot of people also choose to duplicate the background layer, but because I'm not doing anything on the background layer, I shouldn't need to do that. So I'm going to create a new layer. This is just a new blank layer. I don't even duplicate the layer. The next step with my spot healing brush, I have some options up here. The one that I want to change for when I'm working with this for retouching, because I'm going to remove the blemishes around her mouth, around her face, is the sample all layers. What this will enable me to do is do the spot retouching onto this layer. So I'm going to zoom up a little bit. The rule for the spot healing brush is that the circle should be slightly larger than the spot. So I'm just going to click on it. And sometimes I'm a bit lazy about resizing my brush if I think I can get away with it. I'm not working on a Wacom tablet right now, but if I was, it would be easier for me to change the brush size. Now this very large spot, I need to go quite a bit larger. I may need to switch to the healing brush if the spot healing brush doesn't work. Actually, it did a pretty good job. Sometimes it's been hit or miss. When I've used this example in class. I use it in my on ground class, so I've retouched this so many times. It's pretty much second nature. I should also point out that I have the filthiest screen right now. I can see a dot here, which I suspect won't exist on your recording. So if I look like I'm spotting out things that you guys know aren't there, that's just a result of me not having cleaned my screen for a while. So you can actually draw in a line with this too. You'll see I can click or I can draw a short line. Again, I can't tell if some of these are actually on her or on my screen. So a natural retouch, that looks like it's on her, which it is something that we want to keep in all of the skin texture. We don't want to remove that. We just want to take out most of the spots, blend it in. The majority of spots I've taken out have been blemishes, which are non-permanent. I did one thing that was an error, which was I took out a mole. So this is what I've done. You can see on my layer 1, here I have all of these spots that are being removed using the healing brush. If I turn that on, it looks fine. If I turn that off, all those spots are still here. whenever I'm done with spot healing, I always turn this layer on and off to see if I'm getting any little circles where it hasn't mixed with the skin properly. This actually looks pretty good. There's not much that I would need to change on that. So the spot that I was talking about was a problem was this one. You could probably say that these two are also moles. But this one being in isolation, I would probably just grab the erase tool and come in and bring it back. Now I've got to see where it is. So it's on here and there, it's back in. So anytime you remove something that you feel that shouldn't be removed, then just go ahead and take it out. And really what we're trying to do with this is to keep the natural parts of her skin normal, and then just take out the bits that we think are problematic. So blemishes are something which we know is ephemeral, in other words it will disappear over time. It's temporary. We take those out in a natural heal. Nobody wants to see their face covered in pimples 10 years later when their skin is clear. So things like moles I would be more likely to leave in. Scars especially I would leave in. If I was doing a fashion retouch, there would be an art director directing me as to what to leave in and what to leave out. So the next thing that we need to do is start adding adjustment layers to correct some of the red tones. If I zoom out on her a little bit, you can see that I think the balance is slightly out in the overall photo. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a HueSaturation adjustment layer. So this just sits on top, and again using this reduced screen resolution it's a little bit more difficult for me, but I can pretty much see what I need to. There are certain things you can use in here. One is the targeted adjustment tool. So if I didn't want to mess around with HueSaturation lightness, I can just grab the bit which I think is a problematic color and I can slide to adjust it. And you'll notice that there's some changes happening on here. First of all, the target adjustment tool has told me that the color shift in here are the reds. So I'm taking out the red. It has told me that the reds need to be desaturated. There doesn't need to be any shift in hue. And there doesn't need to be any shift in lightness. As an alternative, I already knew I was going to have to take the reds out because that's where the color shift is. I can also lighten the skin. I can darken it, which is going to make it grayer. And, you know, it's all really going to depend on what I want for the final result and how true to the final image it would be. So I'm going to lighten it just a little bit, and if I adjusted the hues, you'd see I can add a bluey magenta cast or a yellowy cast. With this, I sometimes go a little bit towards the yellow. It's interesting because with there is a slightly bluish cast to it, but I'm only adjusting the red. So when I'm adjusting it towards the yellow, I'm taking out some of the blue out of the skin tone. So to see what it looked like, when I turn this on and off, you can now see it's corrected a good part of her hair and it's corrected her skin tone. Now I appreciate there's going to be monitor difference in this. I'm also working with my monitor screen at 50% to save battery life, so I could be over lightening it a little bit. So now I want to add in more adjustment layers to fix in some of these other areas. I need to take out the net wrinkles. I'm going to take out these little wrinkles under the lines, under the eyes. This is probably the biggest bit to remove, and there's different ways that I can do that. I might be able to do it with an adjustment layer, but first of all I'm going to do the adjustment layer to take the red out of the eyes. So for this one I think I'm going to use a color balance adjustment rather than a hue and saturation one. The hue and saturation gives me the options of lightening the tones and desaturating just a longer colour shade. So you could do reds, you could do yellows, blues, etc. But colour balance will allow me to adjust for the midtones, the shadows and the highlights. And if I added red in, it would look like this. If I added cyan in, it would look like this. Obviously these adjustments are too great, and the only bit that I really want to do is around the eyes. So from here, I want to, whenever you use an adjustment layer, it automatically comes with a layer mask. So I'm going to click on the layer mask. You'll notice that here, this changes to the layer mask layer mask panel. And I'm going to invert that, which when I have a black layer mask, and you guys all need to master how layer masks work by the end of this class. It's very simple, inverting them. So I'm using Command I on the keyboard, but I could also go into image adjustment, invert, which will do the same thing as long as you've clicked on the mask icon. So if you're not sure how layer masks work, it's really simple. It's like turning a light on and off in a room. When the light is on, everything can be seen. So right now, if I have a white layer mask on there and I make any kind of adjustment here, it will be seen over the whole image. I'm going to leave that cyan on there and go back to my mask, and you can still see the cyan on the image. If I invert that, so I go from white to black, black when you turn it is like when you turn off the light in the room, it hides everything. So this is what it looked like before I applied the layer mask. So it's as simple as that to make layer mask adjustments. They allow me to control what I'm going to colour on this image now. And I'm going to leave the really strong adjustment on here, the colour balance one. So if you remember, it was the midtones and it was cyan. But I want to make sure I'm painting on the mask. And of course, you can also change the density of the mask. You'll notice over here it goes to grey. So that means that it's only going to do, say, 50 or 60% or 10%, whatever you want it to be. And you can also soften the mask. That will only make a difference when I have a selection on here. So I'm going to keep the density at 100%, so it's a solid black mask right now. So zooming up on her eyes, I'm going to get my paintbrush. And because I have a black layer mask, I'm going to paint in white. And as I paint in white, you're going to see that the red around her eyes is now turning cyan. I only really want to do the eyelid, and she's actually got a red cast inside the whites of her eyes. So I am going to leave it like that, and now I'm going to go back to my adjustments. So I don't want a lot of cyan in there. There's a little bit of blue coming in from the cyan, and my guess is like a touch of magenta in there. So if you want to see what this has done, just turn your adjustment on and off. It looks like I'm adding in a little bit too much green, which may be coming from the cyan, or it may be coming from the magenta. So I'm just going to release those a little bit, and that looks pretty good. It's taken the red out. And interestingly, if you do this on your own image, it might be a little bit easier to see than on the screen recording. This becomes bluer because I've taken out some of the cyan. My layer mask, if I option click on it, so you can't see what I'm doing because I'm holding the option key right now. If I click on that thumbnail, this is what I've painted through. So if I know I've messed it up, I can paint on here. I shouldn't have this big black gap in the middle of it. So I'm just going to paint that through, and that is my rough and ready layer mask. It's got a feathered brush on it, and it's corrected the eyes. So now I'm going to jump back over to layer 1. So I'm going to rename that so you know which one layer 1 is. This is the spot healing. And I'm going to take out these little lines in here. With this I'm going to use the healing brush tool. If she was older, I wouldn't want to remove these entirely. And hold on one second. I just had such a large brush size on there, it was making the image jump against the screen. Again, it's just to do with the low screen resolution. So what I want to do now is come in with my healing brush. So with the difference between the healing brush and the spot healing tool is I need to click to set a sample. So let me just close out my history for a minute. So a sample is just finding a clean bit of skin. If I chose, say, the nostril and then healed with that, it's going to duplicate it. So the point of the spot healing brush is, of the healing brush is if you're not getting a good result with the spot healing tool because Photoshop is guessing at the samples, then just switch over to the healing brush, choose a clean bit of skin, and you should just be able to paint it in. So I'm going to do the same over here. I'm actually going to choose a bit on the cheek because it's a little bit cleaner than under here. Now some people aren't big fans of the healing brush for doing retouching. If you talk to any retoucher, they will all have their own ways of doing it. The one that people most often use now in industry is of course the split frequencies. So if you can get used to using that, that is going to help you for a while. You will notice that I'm going over this with different parts because I'm getting some weird samples in the skin which I don't want. Anywhere where there's a lot of texture, it starts to bring it in. This was shot with depth of field, so the last time I did this as a submission, I was really confused as to why so many people were getting blurry bits over the skin. But it was simply that. It was because they were sampling from this blurred area from the depth of field, not from these cleaner areas. So they're mixing like texture for like texture. Now this area here, I may be able to get improvements done with the healing brush. Watch for any samples that are being introduced. And remember, if there's anything else that's there that you feel should be taken out, just go ahead and take it out. So that looks pretty close to me. Also, I don't want to make this video hours and hours long. So yeah, that doesn't look too bad. There's a bit up here which I think is unresolved and a bit around here which is, and I'm working at a much smaller size just to see what happens. And let's turn that on and off. Not perfect, but close enough for what we want for you guys to get the idea. So now we have that. She's looking pretty good. Let's do the wrinkles. The wrinkles need to be done on their own layer. So I can see I had to step back in history before. I've taken off the skin retouching. And this one will be wrinkle removal. I usually advise naming your layers. It's also really helpful when you guys hand in to me if I can see what it was you're doing. Okay, so wrinkle removal is what you would think it is. We just have to take out some of these. There's different ways you can do it. Some people dodge and burn them out, but the way that I find the quickest, I'm all for speed with this stuff. If I was a self-employed commercial portrait photographer, then doing my own retouching, then I wouldn't want to have to pay someone endless hours for certain degree of perfection. So I'm just taking out most of the wrinkle where I can. I'm just using the healing brush. It's not going to be perfect under the hairline, but I'm not too worried about that. Anywhere where you get close to a hairline, it's going to start picking up. Don't try to do it in one pass. If you do that, you're sampling the same area, and sometimes it's easier to work with different samples so that you're not getting any kind of weird repetition. So I just do it, I build it up over time and try to avoid anywhere that you are cloning in areas of darkness from other shadow tone areas. You might need to take those out. Now, the good thing about this kind of retouching is it doesn't have to be perfect. So that sizing thing comes up because of the way my mouse is set up. So if I can see it's getting muddy, and what I call muddy is, so annoying that that does that. What I'm calling muddy is when it comes up with these patches of blurring and blending on the skin, which I don't really want. But the way we work with wrinkles is we fade them back in. I'm just going to soften this edge, so I don't want to take it out altogether because it's giving her some facial definition. So if I remove it altogether, it's going to start looking weird. So here we go. Then a little bit deeper there again because I'm working at such a small screen resolution. I have to be really precise. So I've taken out most of what needs to come out on there. I know it probably is looking a little bit weird and muddy because that's what happens when you take out wrinkles. Wrinkles and lines actually give the face definition. So this isn't what I want here. What I want to now do is fade these back in. So I'm going to zoom up on it again. So when wrinkle removal is on its own layer, as I've done here, and this all that I do for that is when I'm in any of these brushes, and this one, the healing brushes work slightly different than spot healing. It should be set to current and below, so it's picking up anything that's below this. I didn't want it to clone in anything from the adjustment layers, but you can choose to do all layers, but in this case I just wanted current and below. So if I turn this on and off, you'll see those wrinkles there. So all we do now is give it an opacity change. So we bring the wrinkles back, but they're nowhere near as strong as they were. So I'd go actually a little bit higher than 46. This hides a lot of mess that you might get from the cloning tool, but also keeps the definition in the face and calms down the shadow. Okay, for the eyes are simple. New adjustment layer. I use adjustment layers for most things. They don't stack much weight into the photo. Weight meaning if you duplicate layers all the time, your photos are going to become very file dense. You'll see mine started at 7 meg and it's gone to 22 meg with these layers on it. Every time I double the layer by duplicating it and doing more corrections to the background layer, not only can I not step back, but I can't, in other words, I can't remove anything because I'd have to remove an entire layer usually to do it, but it also doubles the length, the size of the file. So this is 7.5 roughly, so if I duplicate the background layer once, it would go to 15. If I duplicate it a third time, it would be at 30. So if I had as many layers as this, which is 5, it would be somewhere around 60 megabytes as opposed to 22. So there's often reasons that we do things a certain way. So with this, I've just realized I put on color balance. I meant to put on HueSaturation So I want to delete the layer, and I'm going to add on the hue and saturation one. And I again want to hide all mask to be on here, but not immediately. And the reason that I don't want it to be on here immediately is because I want to increase the saturation in the eyes, but without overdoing it. In fact, I could just do it to, let me just check to see it's a cyan. Okay, it's a blue, not a cyan. So I can choose blues, and that's how I know. So if in doubt as to which it is, because sometimes the eyes, it's hard to tell whether they're actually real blue or whether they're cyan. So I'm just going to increase that. Now it's adding it to the whole image, even though it doesn't look like it. So the next step will be to invert the layer mask. Let me just check that that's bright enough. And I'm not seeing that it's doing anything. Oh, I don't know what happened there. So that's probably enough, because I don't want them to be too blue. I actually want them to be a little bit lighter though. And you can even adjust this if you want to change the color. I would probably just go a little bit around +1. I want to take a little bit of the lightness out because it's over lightening them. So this is what I have over the whole image. So now I'm going to invert my layer mask and just paint in the eyes. Now some of these adjustments are actually going to be surprisingly subtle. So you can see that one has lightened them just a little bit. I can do the same with the lips if I want. Again, it's not always adding colour, it's often just working with the colour that's on there. So I'm adding a new hue saturation layer, and this time I'm going to increase the saturation of the lips, but I don't want to do it too much. And I'm going to darken them slightly. And I'm actually going to take them to a slightly less pinky tone. And I can of course adjust these at any point after. And again, I've just remembered I wanted to do that to just the reds. It's not really going to matter much because it's going to be masked, but it makes sense to do it to the reds. So I'm adding some colour here. I'm adjusting it a little bit cooler or more orange and a little bit darker. So now same thing again, invert the mask, and now I can just paint on it. Because I've inverted all these masks, I'm painting on it with white. So that's that, and here you can see I just darken them a little bit. If I want to darken them more, it's easy enough. I've got to go back to reds. I'll add in a little bit more saturation and probably a little bit more darkness, so it looks like she has just slightly darker lips than she does. And there, that's the adjustment. So you'll notice that everything I'm doing using pretty much adjustment layers or healing. And with this area, the hair, the adjustment layer actually fixed most of it, but I'm going to do this a slightly different way. I'm going to go up to my topmost layer and add a new blank layer on here. So not everybody does this the way I'm doing it, but you'll find it works remarkably well. I don't have time to go and mask this as well as I should, so it's going to be a little bit haphazard. It's only because I'm reaching 30 minutes on the recording already. Retouching takes time, as I'm sure you can appreciate, so I'm trying to minimize how well I do it so that I can stop you from having to watch anything longer than 30 minutes. Okay, so with the color picker, I've set it to a red because I want a certain color in her hair. I don't know that I want it red, but I can adjust for that later. So I'm going to come up and paint into the hair. So what I would normally do for this is to mask the edges of the skin. I really don't want anything on here that is going to bleed into the skin. Most of all, I want to get the white regrowth on here. Now, if you use a brush and you just mark with the brush, you can hold down the Shift key to draw lines on it. This is one of the handiest and probably least known tools in Photoshop. So I'm just holding down the Shift key and it's drawing those lines around the hair. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just putting in a dot and moving this so I can get to it better. Now I'm holding down the Shift key and I'm just drawing this down in lines. This means I don't have to be quite as exact in where I'm drawing. And I'll probably come and erase parts of the mask later. I'm just painting with it normally now because I don't need it quite so even. Sometimes around here when I'm masking, I will come through like that, just so I can get in fairly close to the face, and then I can use a bigger brush to brush in around the rest of it. I don't really need those straggly bits in there. They're going to inherit a certain amount of colour from the background anyway, because the background is whitish. You can also use this method or an adjustment layer to remove some of that magenta that you can see in the t-shirt. I'm going to skip that step because it's fairly easy if you can do the rest of these. Okay, so this looks weird, as you might think, as you would expect it to. So this is the magic of what we can now do with Photoshop. I can go and add an overlay on it, or soft light, or multiply. The one that I'm most likely to use to correct here, incidentally, is soft light, but you'll see that even with a multiply, as long as I lower the opacity, I can change the hair color to a certain extent. So once you've painted on the hair, you're going to use a combination of three things: a blending mode, an opacity change, and we're going to apply hue and saturation directly to the layer. So this is it on multiply, this is now it on overlay, which gives you a brassier color, and this is it on soft light, which will give you something closer to her natural color. And of course I can adjust the opacity more or less as I need to. And leave this on multiply for a moment. So to use an adjustment layer that is actually directly on the layer, because I don't want to add in another adjustment on here, I just want this color to be right, you're going to go Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation. The quick key for this is Command U. And here you can see I can run the hue button across here. So remember, this is on multiply. Multiply makes things darker. So if I wanted to give her pink here, I could adjust the saturation. And if I didn't want it to be quite so intense, I can push up the lightness. And I'm going to do this to the whole master color because this enables me to change the color that I have on this layer. So if I want to look at what this layer color is now, with the multiply and opacity settings, it's now a bright pink, which is what's coming up on her hair color. I don't really want to do it on multiply, I want to do it on soft light. She has blonde hair. So I'm going to redo the HueSaturation Adjustment. You can redo this as many times as you want. It's really just changing the colors. So I want something in this vicinity, but less saturated and probably a little bit lighter. So what I'm going for is a strawberry blonde color. So I'm going to hit OK to that, turn that on and off, and you can see it's lightened her hair color. Now that looks fairly good. That looks close to what I want it to be. This is the actual color I've got. You can barely see it. Of course, I can increase the opacity and go for an even lighter blonde. If I put it up to 100%, it looks a little bit wrong. So I'm going to put it around the 60% mark. So again, you can see how much I've lightened her hair to give her a blonde coloured hair. And now what I want to do, this is hair base colour. I'm going to duplicate that. This is making her hair even lighter. So what I want to do here is, first of all, I want to erase the bottom parts of the hair, and I'm actually going to do that with a layer mask. I'm doing it with a layer mask rather than the erase tool, is because I might need to bring some of that colour back in. Excuse me, I didn't put on a layer mask. I hit the new layer button by accident. So here's my layer mask. I want everything to be masked through, so my light is essentially turned on, so I can see everything beneath this. And I'm just going to mask on the lower part of the hair. At this point, I need to change from a white brush to a black brush. So press X on the keyboard. And this is taking it down to the base layer. Okay, so if I take that on and off, you can see what it's doing. Now what I want to do here on this top layer is I want to darken it, because I want to start to match it in to the colour that's on there. I also want to increase the saturation, and I want to make it slightly more yellow. So here I'm fixing up the tonal values. So I could try doing this with a multiply and then really lowering the opacity on that, which also works fairly well. So there's more than one way to do it. I kind of feel that the soft light is giving me a bit better blend, but I want to have that pushed up fairly high so it blends into the rest of the hair. And the last little bit that I'm going to do, I'm going to use the Desaturation brush, which is not that one, it's on the Dodge and Burn tools. It's called the sponge tool, and this will allow me to desaturate just a little. So I don't want to do it at 50%, it would be way too much, but it's going to allow me to take out just a little bit of the saturation in the hair. Especially in the redder bits on here. So especially where it's hitting the scalp. Let me just see if I increase it a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing, add a mask. And in fact, I don't need to add a mask. and do the same thing on here, just to take out a little bit of that brassiness. For those of you that dye your hair blonde, it's kind of the equivalent of putting a silver rinse through it to take out some of this orangey colour that ends up in here. There's other ways to desaturate as well. I could just do it with an image HueSaturation and desaturate that way, which would be quicker. The reason I was using the sponge, and it will never desaturate back to nothing because we still have the hair layer down here on the background. So look how little of it is being touched. You can see the grey areas of desaturation. It would be possible to even desaturate down here a little bit for giving it the look of a more natural blonde. What I may do is even duplicate this colour now. So this is the hair base, so I can call it hair final. And this will allow me to use the HueSaturation layer so I definitely don't want to shift the colour. Let me just I've obviously changed it to green, so I'm going to have to put it back into the yellow range. So if I want a much more natural blonde, could be lighter, could be darker, I'd probably go a little bit lighter. I think I made it a little bit too dark there. You can add a final base layer. Looking at that, I think I've accidentally made it grey. So what I'm going to do, there was something I messed up when I duplicated this. So I'll just do it quickly again. So here's the yellow, and bearing in mind that this is still on an opacity layer, so I can tweak that too. Go just a little bit darker on here. And it's something to do with the soft light blend that's messing this up, so I'll try a darken blend is a bit closer. You can actually see, for some reason, the colour's coming out blue, which wasn't the colour that I chose. It's mixing it in. So I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm just going to do it as a normal HueSaturation layer. And by that I accidentally turned off all my layers. I think something's changed on here. I think that's where the problem is coming from. Let's see if I can just rework it from here. Kind of reset itself for some reason. And it's doing it again. It should not be changing. It should just be automatically taking on the new HueSaturation. So because that's been so troublesome, I'll show you one other way to do it. It's still using HueSaturation, but you have this little colorize button here, and this will allow me to quickly change this. This is actually putting a flat color on it, but I still use it for hair sometimes, especially where I have transparency on it, and I can darken it or again lighten it, and it's going to go to a pretty nice blonde, and it's taking out some of the brassiness that I had before. So this is pretty much a natural retouch. I've lightened the hair considerably. Whether or not I would do that normally, I'm not sure I would, but I wanted you to know all the different ways that you can do this. And remember, the myth about retouching is it requires these really advanced things. All I'm using is adjustment layers, a paintbrush on a new layer with a HueSaturation on it, and 2 retouching layers. One that's set to a lower opacity because I want to allow some of the retouch to show through, and the other at a higher opacity. So this was the before, this is the after. I've made certain choices here, which you may choose not to do, which is I lightened her skin as part of taking the red out. But you can see, if I zoom up on here, all the detail is still in there. I haven't touched anything to do with the skin texture other than cloning it, but I've cloned, sorry, not cloning, I should use the right terminology, healing, but I've healed from the areas that already had pronounced pores in them, and it comes up with a pretty simple, effective, and good retouch.